Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The axe fell with the sound of a promise being broken, a sharp, resonant crack that split the vast, unforgiving silence of the New Mexico foothills. Each swing was a heartbeat, a declaration of defiance against a world that had cast them out. Sweat and sawdust clung to Koda's bare chest, his powerful muscles coiling and uncoiling under sun-darkened skin as he carved a home from the wilderness, a sanctuary for a love the world deemed impossible. He worked not with rage, but with a fierce, quiet purpose, for he was not just building with wood, but with hope. From the half-finished doorway, Eliza Vance watched him, her small frame a study in contrasts against the raw, golden timbers. In her eyes, a fragile dream wrestled with a lifetime of fear. This cabin was more than a shelter. It was proof that she, a woman deemed too small to survive, could plant roots in this barren soil. But peace in this land was a fragile thing, easily shattered. On the horizon, a cloud of dust began to swell, a malignant stain rising from the plains. It was not a storm of nature, but of men. Hoofbeats grew from a distant murmur to a vengeful thunder, and at their head rode Jedediah Hargrove, his face a mask of bitter greed, and beside him, the tarnished star of Sheriff Marshal Thorne, a man sworn to law but riding to enforce injustice. They came not just to halt the hammers, but to tear this fledgling dream down, log by splintered log, and salt the very earth it stood upon. Will this fragile sanctuary, built by the hands of an outcast and a giant, be burned to the ground before its roof is even raised? Stay with us to witness a love story forged in fire and grit. And if you believe in the power of the underdog, show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Wild West Love Stories for more tales that ride against the wind. Part 1. A Claim of Dust and Stone. Sevens. The town of Dry Creek existed as a stubborn footnote in the vast, sun-bleached page of the New Mexico territory. Its buildings, bleached to the color of bone by a relentless sun, slumped against each other for support, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the endless expanse of dust and scrub. Into this crucible of quiet desperation walked Eliza Vance. At not quite 5 feet tall, she was a figure easily overlooked, yet there was a ramrod straightness to her spine that defied her stature, a set to her jaw that spoke of battles fought and survived in silence. Her boots were scuffed, the brim of her hat frayed, but her gaze, as she pushed open the groaning door of Silas Croft's general store, was as clear and steady as a winter morning. The murmur of conversation within faltered, then died completely, replaced by a thick, judgmental silence. Men in worn denim leaned against barrels, their talk of drought and cattle prices forgotten as they turned to stare. A woman with a face like wrinkled parchment whispered to her companion, loud enough to carry, barely bigger than a sack of flour. Silas Croft himself, a man whose soul seemed as dry and dusty as the goods on his shelves, peered over his spectacles. "Well now," he drawled, his voice a gravelly scrape. "Look what the wind blew in. It's the little sparrow, come down from her nest of rocks. What can I do for you, Miss Vance? Run out of pebbles to eat?" The men shared a low, rumbling chuckle. Eliza ignored them, her focus absolute. She approached the counter, placing her meager coin purse upon its worn surface before stating her needs in a clear, unwavering voice. "A sack of corn seed, Mr. Croft. The hardiest you've got. And 20 feet of rope." Croft raised a skeptical eyebrow, making a show of stroking his chin. "Corn seed, you say? Up on that patch you claimed? Hargrove's Folly, we call it. Nothing's grown there since the good Lord saw fit to make it. Not even weeds have the stomach for that ground." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're wasting your coin, girl. That land's cursed." Eliza met his gaze. "The land isn't cursed, Mr. Croft. It's just waiting for someone stubborn enough to ask it nicely." She counted out her coins, each one a small sacrifice. The transaction was completed in a tense silence, and as she hefted the heavy sack, she could feel the weight of their collective pity and scorn. It was a weight she had carried her entire life. As she stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, a shadow fell across her path. Jedediah Hargrove stood there, flanked by his usual cronies, including the loutish Caleb Thorne. Jed was handsome in a cruel, predatory way, with a smile that never reached his eyes. He represented a part of Eliza's past she fought daily to forget: the westward wagon train, the fever that took her parents, and the subsequent decision by the Hargrove family, Jed's parents, to abandon a small, sick orphan girl at the edge of the territory because she had become a useless burden. Seeing her now, not just alive, but daring to claim a piece of land he considered his birthright, was an affront to his very being. "Well, well," Jed sneered, blocking her way. "Little Clara, I thought the coyotes would have picked your bones clean by now." Eliza flinched at the use of her old name, a name that belonged to a helpless child. "My name is Eliza," she said, her voice tight. "And I've got work to do." She tried to step around him, but he moved with her, a menacing dance. "Work?" he scoffed, his eyes glinting with malice as they roamed over the sack of seeds in her arms. "You call trying to farm that pile of rocks work? My father used to say that land held a secret, but a little thing like you would die of thirst before you ever found it." He reached out suddenly, not to strike her, but to knock the sack from her grasp. The burlap hit the dusty street with a dull thud, splitting open. Precious corn seeds, her entire investment, her future, spilled across the dirt like scattered gold. "Oops," Jed said, his smile widening as Caleb and the others laughed. Humiliation and rage warred within Eliza. She dropped to her knees, desperate to salvage what she could, her fingers scrambling in the dust. Jed nudged her aside with the toe of his polished boot. "This is no place for dolls, Eliza. Run back to whatever hole you crawled out of before you get hurt." It was then that the world seemed to shift. The laughter died in the men's throats, their smirks freezing on their faces. A presence had joined them, so silent in its approach that it felt as if he had risen from the earth itself. He was immense, a Comanche man who towered over everyone, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His black hair was woven into 2 long braids, and a simple, carved necklace rested against the powerful muscles of his chest. His face was a mask of stoic calm, but his eyes, dark and deep as a starless night, were fixed on the spilled seeds. This was Koda. He didn't speak. He simply moved. He stepped past a frozen Jedediah, stooped down, and with one large hand, lifted the hoe Eliza had dropped. He placed it gently back into her trembling grasp. Then he knelt, his movements economical and precise, and began scooping the corn back into the torn sack, his calloused fingers treating each kernel as if it were a jewel. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft scrape of his hands in the dust. When he had gathered all he could, he stood to his full, intimidating height and held the sack out to Eliza. Their fingers brushed as she took it, his skin warm and rough against hers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He turned his gaze upon Jed, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, a rumble like distant thunder. "The earth does not care how small the hand that plants the seed." Jed, for all his arrogance, took an involuntary step back, unnerved by the quiet authority in the man's voice. Without another word, Koda reached into a pouch at his belt, drew out a single, perfect eagle feather bound with a strip of leather, and placed it gently on the ground beside Eliza's feet. Then, he turned and walked away, his moccasins making no sound on the gravelly street, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. The days that followed were a testament to Eliza's will. She worked from the first hint of dawn until her muscles screamed in the twilight, fueled by a desperation that bordered on madness. Her claim was a harsh, unforgiving landscape of rock and thorny brush. Her shelter was a miserable lean-to of warped boards and a tattered canvas, a structure that offered little comfort against the biting night winds. She attacked the earth with her shortened hoe, the thud of metal on stone a constant, jarring rhythm that sent shockwaves up her aching arms. Her primary goal was water. She needed a well, but the ground fought her for every inch. She dug until her hands were a raw, blistered mess, moving from one spot to the next, only to be defeated by impenetrable rock. Yet, she kept returning to one particular spot, a small depression near a cluster of struggling cottonwoods. The ground there felt different. It was still hard, but underneath, she sensed a subtle dampness, a hidden promise that kept her digging long after reason told her to quit. It became her obsession, the focal point of her struggle against the indifferent land. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and black with an approaching storm, the heavens opened. Rain fell not as a life-giving shower, but as a cold, driving assault. It found every crack and flaw in her lean-to, soaking her thin blanket and turning the ground beneath her to mud. She huddled in the dark, shivering, listening to the wind howl like a predator, feeling the last of her hope begin to erode. Loneliness was a physical ache in her chest, a cold so deep the rain couldn't touch it. She must have slept, for she awoke to a world washed clean and silent, the storm having passed. Shivering, she crawled out from her damp shelter into the pale light of dawn. And then she saw it. Placed neatly on a flat stone before her doorway, as if presented for her inspection, was a small bird carved from a single piece of pale wood. It was a sparrow, no longer than her hand, but rendered in exquisite detail. Its wings were slightly spread, its head cocked as if listening, its tiny form radiating a fierce, defiant energy. It was smooth as a river stone, and beneath it, burned carefully into the grain, were 3 words. "I saw you." Eliza's breath hitched in her throat. She picked up the carving, her fingers tracing its perfect lines. The wood felt warm, imbued with a life of its own. Her gaze lifted instinctively toward the distant ridge, the place from which she often felt an unseen watchfulness. She saw nothing but mist curling through the pines. A wave of emotion, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over her, not gratitude, not yet, but a profound sense of recognition. Someone had seen her struggle, her failures, her refusal to quit. She was not just a speck in the wilderness. She was seen. Clutching the small wooden sparrow, she looked at her broken shovel, her blistered hands, and the stubborn, unyielding earth. The fight was far from over. But now, for the first time since arriving in this desolate land, she did not feel entirely alone. Part 2. The Shadow and the sparrow. Sevens. The wooden sparrow in Eliza's hand was a tangible piece of hope, a silent testament that she was not alone. She spent the next 2 days working with a renewed, almost frantic energy, her focus narrowed to the stubborn patch of damp earth that might one day yield water. The world beyond her small claim seemed to fade away, replaced by the singular rhythm of her labor. It was on the third morning, as she wrestled a particularly large rock from the hole, that he returned. There was no sound of approach, only a subtle shift in the quality of the light as his large form eclipsed the morning sun. Koda stood at the edge of the clearing, his presence as natural and unassuming as the ancient boulders that dotted the landscape. In his hands, he carried not a weapon, but a length of rope and a sturdy canvas tarpaulin, far superior to the tattered rag she used for a roof. He didn't wait for an invitation or offer a greeting. He walked directly to her wrecked lean-to and began, his movements economical and certain. He pulled away the broken boards, anchored the new canvas with the efficiency of a man who understood the wind's treachery, and used the rope to lash it securely to the steadfast trunks of 2 cottonwood trees. Eliza stood frozen for a long moment, the rock forgotten in her hands, simply watching him work. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his size, a man in complete harmony with his task. When he finished, the new shelter was low and solid, a humble but defiant bastion against the elements. He turned to her, his dark eyes surveying her work, the hole in the ground, her blistered hands. "You listen to the ground," he said, his voice the first sound to break the morning's silence. "You do not fight it. That is worth keeping." She blinked, finding her voice after a moment. "You carved the bird." He gave a single, slow nod. "It is called tiquata, sparrow. Small, but it sings before the storm ends." A silence stretched between them, not awkward, but filled with unspoken understanding. She stepped inside her newly fortified shelter, retrieved her canteen, and held it out to him. He hesitated for a heartbeat before taking it, his large hand dwarfing the metal flask. He drank one measured sip, then returned it. "I am Koda," he said, the name offered with a quiet gravity. "Eliza," she replied, the name feeling more her own than it ever had before. Another nod, and then he turned to leave. Just before the trees swallowed him, he paused. "Build your roots deep, Eliza Sparrow," he said over his shoulder, "so they do not wash away." His words became her mantra. But roots needed protection to grow. Her claim was marked only by a few scattered stones, an open invitation to man and beast. She began the back-breaking work of digging post holes for a fence, a task that made her earlier struggles with the well seem like child's play. It was during this grueling endeavor that she saw them again. Jedediah Hargrove and Caleb Thorne reined in their horses at the edge of her property, their cruel smirks a jarring intrusion into her hard-won solitude. "Look at that, Caleb," Jed drawled, his voice carrying easily on the dry air. "The little mouse is trying to build a cage for herself." Caleb laughed, a harsh, braying sound. "More like a pen. Easy to step over when the time comes." Jed's eyes, however, weren't on Eliza. They were scanning her land with a hungry, calculating intensity, lingering on the cluster of cottonwoods near her well-digging site. "It's another dry one," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "The creek's already running low. A man who controls water in a season like this, he controls everything." The words were a veiled threat, a chilling confirmation of her fears. He knew, or at least suspected, what this land might hold. Eliza gripped her shovel tighter, her knuckles white. Before she could form a reply, Koda stepped out from the shade of the trees where he had been watching, unseen. He said nothing, did nothing, simply stood there, his arms folded across his chest. His silent presence was more potent than any threat. Jed's horse shifted nervously. He shot Koda a look filled with hatred, then spat on the ground. "Enjoy your dirt, Eliza. It's all you'll ever have." With that, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and resentment in their wake. Koda's gaze followed them until they were out of sight, then turned to the series of shallow, crooked holes Eliza had managed to dig. He walked over, picked up a heavy timber post as if it were a twig, and set it into one of the holes. He looked at her. "This," he stated simply, "is not strong." Eliza's chin jutted out, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "It is what I can manage." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Together," he said, "is better." And so they began. He didn't ask for permission, and she didn't offer any argument. An unspoken partnership was forged in the rhythm of shared labor. He showed her how to dig deeper, how to set the heavy posts so they wouldn't yield to the wind, how to brace them with rocks. She, in turn, learned quickly, her small frame surprisingly resilient, her determination a match for his strength. They worked side by side for days, enveloped in a cocoon of physical exertion and quiet companionship. He would drive the stakes with a heavy mallet, the force of his blows echoing through the valley, and she would follow, bracing them, her hands pushing against the rough wood until he was satisfied it was secure. He taught her how to measure the distance between rails using the length of her own arms as a guide, a simple, practical lesson that made her feel like a part of the design, not just a laborer. By the time the sun climbed high each day, she would be panting, her clothes soaked with sweat and her hair caked with dust, but a fierce sense of accomplishment burned within her. "You work too fast," she said one afternoon, leaning against a newly set post to catch her breath. Koda didn't stop his work. "You keep up," he replied, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. During a break, they sat in the sparse shade of the cottonwoods. She sipped from her canteen while he sharpened a hand axe with a smooth river stone, the rhythmic shiek of steel on stone, a soothing sound. The silence between them had become comfortable, a space where words were not always necessary. "I was taken once," he said suddenly, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the distant ridge. Eliza blinked, startled by the unexpected confidence. "Taken?" He nodded, not looking at her. "Mission school. Far south. They cut my hair. Gave me a number instead of a name." He paused, the memory casting a shadow across his face. "They said my tongue was wrong. My gods were wrong. My ways were wrong." A deep frown creased Eliza's brow. "How old were you?" 10 summers, he said. "I left after 2. Escaped through a creek bed during winter. Walked 4 days to find my people again." Eliza sat very still, imagining a small boy, alone and freezing, fighting his way back to everything he had ever known. That must have been terrifying. "It was cold," he said simply, as if that single word encompassed all the horror. She studied his face, the profound calm that seemed etched into his features, and understood that it was not an absence of feeling, but a mastery over it. I never went to school, she found herself saying, the words coming out in a soft rush. Not really. My father taught me to read before he died. After that, there were just books and work. But people always looked at me and said I was too small. Useless. Pretty little thing, they'd say. No good for farming, no good for a man. Just a waste of space. She looked away, her voice dropping to a whisper. Sometimes, I believed them. You are not, Koda said, the words spoken with an unshakable certainty that cut through her shame. He stood, walked to a small pack he had left by the trees, and returned. He knelt before her, his large frame humbling itself. In his hands, he held a pair of gloves, crafted from soft, supple deerskin, worn smooth in places and stitched with the precision of an artist. He gently placed them in her lap. Wood has splinters, he said, his dark eyes meeting hers. So does pride. Protect your hands. Both kinds. She stared down at the gloves, then back up at him, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. You made these? He nodded once. Thank you, she said, her voice thick. No one's ever given me something like this. You earned it, he replied. You stay. You build. That is rare. They returned to work, the gloves fitting her hands as if they had been made for them. The fence line grew steadily, a tangible symbol of their joint effort, a neat, strong scar on the wild landscape. When the last rail was set, they stood together, looking out over what they had accomplished. The fence enclosed her lean-to, her meager garden patch, and the stubborn hole that was her hope for a well. It was a small kingdom, but it was hers, and now it was safe. But Koda's gaze was on the flimsy canvas shelter. A line of dark clouds was gathering in the west, mirroring the storm that had nearly broken her just days ago. This, he said, his voice low but firm, gesturing toward the lean-to, will not last the winter. Eliza's heart tightened. I know. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Let me build a cabin. She stared at him, speechless. A cabin? Real walls. A roof that wouldn't leak. A hearth for a fire that would stay lit. The idea was so audacious, so far beyond the scope of her own desperate imaginings, that she couldn't process it. You want to build me a house? He nodded. Yes. There is good pine on the ridge. Strong. I can bring it down. Build real walls. A home. To survive, not just hide. His eyes met hers, steady and sincere. There was no pity in them, only a frank assessment of her need and an offer of profound, unconditional help. Eliza swallowed hard, her mind reeling. She looked at her pathetic lean-to, at her hands, now protected by his gloves, at the solid, unyielding fence they had built together. A home. It was a word she hadn't dared to even think. The people in town, she began, the old fears rising. I do not ask them, Koda said, his voice cutting through her doubts. I ask you. The choice hung in the air between them, heavy and momentous. This was more than an offer of lumber and labor. It was an offer of partnership, of a shared future. It was terrifying, and it was everything she had ever wanted. I'll think about it, she finally managed to say. He did not press, merely nodded in acceptance. I will come when the moon is new, he said. If you say yes, I bring tools." Then he turned and walked back toward the ridge, his footsteps as soft as mist over stone, leaving her alone with the fence, the coming storm, and a choice that would define the rest of her life. Part 3. Whispers on the wind, hammers on the wood. Sevens. The new moon was a sliver of silver in an ink-black sky, a silent witness to Eliza's decision. She didn't need to speak when Koda appeared at the edge of her clearing, his silhouette immense against the starlight. He carried not just tools, but an aura of profound purpose. Her answer was in the small, steady campfire she had built, a beacon of welcome in the vast darkness. It was in the way she stood her ground, her small form no longer radiating desperation, but a quiet, resolute readiness. Her yes was a silent pact between them, understood in the space between heartbeats. The following dawn, the real work began. Koda led her up the pine-strewn ridge, a place that smelled of earth and eternity. He moved through the forest with a reverent familiarity, placing his hand on the trunks of certain trees, assessing their strength, their straightness, their spirit. He taught her the language of the wood, showing her how the grain told the story of a tree's life, its struggles against wind and drought. There were no nails in his design. "Wood does not like metal," he explained, his voice a low rumble. "It holds its own weight, if you know how to ask." The first tree fell with a sound that seemed to shake the world, a deep groan of surrender that echoed through the valley. It felt to Eliza like a momentous, almost sacred act. They spent days stripping the great logs of their bark, a laborious, sticky task that left their hands and clothes covered in resin. But in the shared effort, a new level of intimacy bloomed. She learned the rhythm of his movements, the quiet grunt of exertion when he lifted a particularly heavy log, the way his eyes would soften when she mastered a new skill. He, in turn, learned the surprising strength in her small frame, the tenacity that burned in her like a pilot light, refusing to be extinguished. He showed her how to use a draw knife to peel the bark in long, satisfying ribbons, and how to hew the logs flat on two sides. He taught her how to cut the saddle notches at the corners, a precise, interlocking design that would bind the walls together like folded hands in prayer. Her first attempts were clumsy, but he was a patient teacher, guiding her hands with his own, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the sun. As the cabin walls began to rise, log by painstaking log, a different kind of construction was taking place in Dry Creek. Jedediah Hargrove, enraged by the sight of progress on what he considered his land, began to weave a tapestry of poison. In the dusty confines of the town saloon, over glasses of cheap whiskey, he painted a lurid picture for anyone who would listen. He spoke of Eliza not as a determined homesteader, but as a bewitched, foolish girl who had fallen under the spell of a savage. He hinted at dark rituals taking place under the moon, of a Comanche heathen defiling the land with his pagan presence. Caleb Thorne and his ilk eagerly amplified the rumors, adding their own crude embellishments until the story took on a monstrous life of its own. Fear, that old and powerful currency of the frontier, began to change hands. Women pulled their children closer when they saw Eliza in town for supplies. Men who had once offered a grudging nod now stared at her with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. Silas Croft's store became a gauntlet of hostile silence. Jed's campaign culminated in a formal challenge at the land surveyor's office. He stood before the harried clerk, a sheaf of old, yellowed maps in his hand, claiming a discrepancy in the original survey, insisting the plot Eliza held was, by rights, part of the original Hargrove pasture. The clerk, a small man intimidated by Jed's aggressive certainty, was wavering. It was then that Abigail Reed made her entrance. She moved with the unhurried grace of a woman accustomed to authority, her very presence seeming to lower the temperature in the stuffy room. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I was present when this territory was surveyed. I was also present when my late husband signed the charter for this town. And I was the one who personally reviewed and countersigned Miss Vance's claim. The paperwork is ironclad, the boundaries are correct, and your grievance, sir, is nothing more than petty avarice dressed up as legal procedure." She laid a hand on Eliza's shoulder, a simple gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. Jed, faced with a will stronger and more respected than his own, could only retreat, his face a mask of thwarted fury. The legal battle was won, but the seeds of hatred had been sown. Later that week, Deputy Ben Younger sought out Mrs. Reed as she swept her porch. The young lawman looked troubled, his gaze shifting nervously. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low, "I don't mean to overstep, but the things Jed Hargrove and the sheriff's brother are saying, it's getting ugly. And the sheriff, he listens to his family. I'm worried they might try to find a reason, any reason, to make trouble for Miss Vance and the Comanche." Abigail stopped sweeping and looked at him, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Thank you for your integrity, Benjamin," she said. "It is a rare commodity. We will be watchful." Back at the claim, ignorance of the town's growing hostility was a blissful shield. Eliza and Koda were immersed in the world they were creating. The cabin now had 4 walls, a solid, fragrant fortress of pine that smelled of safety and the future. One afternoon, as they prepared to set the main roof beam, Koda paused. He took out his knife and, with Eliza watching in puzzled silence, began to carve into the great log that would sit directly above the doorframe. With slow, sure strokes, the shape of a bird emerged from the wood, not just any bird, but a sparrow, its wings tucked, its eyes alert, its small form a perfect echo of the gift he had first given her. "For luck?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but for a deep sincerity in his eyes. "So the roof knows who lives below it," he said. "So it knows who to protect." Her throat constricted. He wasn't just building her a house, he was embedding her story, her very essence, into its heart. She reached out and traced the carving with her fingertips. "You are the sparrow," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Small does not mean weak. The sparrow flies when larger birds sink." It was a moment of profound connection, a quiet declaration that transcended the need for grander words. It was in the midst of this shared moment of creation, as they stood admiring the carved beam, that the outside world intruded. A lone rider approached, not from the direction of the town, but from the northern ridges, the lands of the Comanche. The rider was tall and lean, his features sharp and serious, carrying himself with the proud bearing of a warrior. He dismounted and addressed Koda in the fluid, guttural tones of their native tongue. It was Tashunka. This, Eliza knew instinctively, was the midpoint, the moment the world tilted on its axis. Though she could not understand the words, she could read the language of the body, the deep lines of concern on Tashunka's face, the growing tension in Koda's shoulders. The conversation was urgent, earnest, and fraught with conflict. Tashunka gestured toward the north, then toward the nearly finished cabin, his hands carving arguments in the air. Koda's replies were low and measured, but Eliza could see the war being waged within him. She saw his loyalty to this man, his friend, and his duty to his people warring with the new purpose he had found here, with her. She was the immovable object, and his tribe was the irresistible force, and he was caught, brutally, between them. She felt a sudden, piercing shame. In her own struggle for survival, she had never truly considered the full context of his. He was not just a man, he was a Comanche man, with a history, a family, a nation that had claims on his heart and his strength. The whispers in town were a nuisance, Jed a danger, but this was a conflict of the soul. After what felt like an eternity, Tashunka placed a hand on Koda's shoulder, a gesture of respect, perhaps even of sorrow. He mounted his horse, gave Eliza a long, unreadable look, and rode away, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than any they had yet shared. The hammers were quiet. The wind whispered through the pines, but now it sounded less like a song and more like a warning. The cabin walls stood strong around them, but for the first time, Eliza wondered if they were building a home or a cage. Part 4. Crossroads of a Savage Heart. The silence Tashunka left behind was a living thing, a heavy blanket of unspoken questions and newfound anxieties that smothered the simple satisfaction of their labor. The half-finished cabin, moments before a symbol of hope, now seemed to mock them with its vulnerability. Eliza looked at Koda, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she saw past the quiet strength and the gentle hands. She saw a man caught between two worlds, a man whose heart was being claimed by warring loyalties. The shame she had felt earlier now solidified into a steely resolve. She would no longer be a passive recipient of his protection. She would be his partner. She closed the distance between them, her small hand coming to rest on his forearm. The muscle beneath was tense as stone. "Koda," she said, her voice quiet but firm, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You have a duty to your people, a responsibility. I cannot be the reason you forsake that." It was the hardest thing she had ever said, an offer to release him that felt like tearing a part of herself away. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face, his dark eyes searching hers. For a long moment, he was silent, and in that silence, she felt the full weight of his internal war. "My people face a hard winter," he said finally, his voice a low, rough thing, raw with emotion. "The government treaties shrink our lands. The buffalo are scarce. Tashunka is right. The elders are worried. They believe my strength is needed to hunt, to prepare, to lead." He paused, his gaze drifting to the cabin, the tangible proof of the new life he was building. "For many years, my strength was for them alone. After the mission school, after I lost my wife to the fever, my duty was all I had left. It was my shelter." He looked back at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. "But a shelter without warmth is a tomb. Here," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "with you, I am building a home. My choice is to stay, to finish what we started. My duty is to my heart, as well as my blood." The honesty of his confession was a powerful, unbreakable bond. Eliza's fingers tightened on his arm. In that moment, they were no longer a man helping a woman, but two souls choosing each other against the judgment of two different worlds. This newfound, fragile peace was shattered 2 days later by the improbable sound of a stagecoach laboring up the rough track toward her claim. It was a lumbering, dust-caked beast, utterly alien in this wild landscape. When it creaked to a halt, The door swung open, and a woman stepped out, a figure so out of place she seemed to have materialized from a different reality. She wore a traveling dress of dark silk, now gray with dust, a bonnet with a wilting feather, and carried a leather satchel as if it were a shield. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and horrified disbelief. It was a face Eliza hadn't seen in 10 years. "Eliza?" the woman breathed, her voice thin and reedy. "My dear heavens, is that truly you?" It was her Aunt Beatrice, her mother's sister from Boston. Eliza stood frozen, as if struck by lightning, the world narrowing to this ghost from her past. Beatrice rushed forward, her fine shoes stumbling on the uneven ground, and enveloped Eliza in a hug that smelled of lavender and mothballs. "Oh, you poor child," she cried, pulling back to survey Eliza's worn work clothes, her calloused hands, her sun-browned face. Her gaze then fell upon the half-built cabin, and then to Koda, who had emerged and stood watching, his massive frame radiating a quiet suspicion. Beatrice's face went from pale to ashen. "Good heavens," she whispered, taking a step back. "What is this? This place? And who is that?" The reunion was a jarring cacophony of conflicting emotions. Over the next hour, inside the cramped but sturdy shelter Koda had built, Beatrice laid out her story of a decade-long search, of hiring agents and following cold trails, all to find her lost niece. And now that she had, her relief was completely overshadowed by her horror. "You cannot stay here, Eliza," she insisted, her voice trembling with conviction as she eyed Koda, who sat outside, sharpening his axe with deliberate, rhythmic strokes, giving them privacy but remaining a formidable presence. "This is no life for a civilized woman. It is savage. I have a comfortable home in Boston. You will have your own room, fine dresses, proper meals. You can attend lectures, meet respectable people. You will have a future, a real future. You must come back with me." The offer was a siren song, a vision of a life of ease and acceptance she had never known. For a fleeting, dizzying moment, she could almost picture it. Meanwhile, in Dry Creek, Jed Hargrove had found his opportunity. News had arrived that a nearby rancher was missing 4 horses, last seen wandering toward the southern trails. It was a common enough occurrence, but in Jed's malicious mind, it was a gift. He stormed into the sheriff's office, his voice ringing with false outrage. "It's him, Thorne," he declared. "It has to be the Comanche. He's been seen roaming those ridges for weeks. He's a thief, a savage. Are you going to let him build a fortress up there and steal us blind?" Sheriff Thorne, a man who valued a quiet life, was hesitant, but the pressure from his brother Caleb and the simmering fear Jed had stoked in the town was mounting. "We have no proof, Jed," the sheriff argued weakly. "Proof?" Jed scoffed. "A white girl living alone with him isn't proof enough that something's wrong. He's either bewitched her or he's holding her captive. It's your duty to act. The people are demanding it. Form a posse. Let's ride up there and find out the truth." The word posse hung in the air, a promise of righteous, legal violence. The sheriff, his spine weakened by prejudice and political pressure, finally, reluctantly, agreed. The dust cloud on the horizon was sickeningly familiar, but this time it was larger, angrier. Eliza's heart plummeted as the posse, a dozen men, led by Sheriff Thorne and a triumphant-looking Jed Hargrove, thundered into the clearing. Aunt Beatrice let out a small shriek and retreated into the lean-to. Koda rose to his feet, setting his axe aside but standing near it, his body a formidable shield between the riders and the home they were building. "Miss Vance!" the sheriff called out, his voice strained with false authority. "We've had a report of stolen horses. Witnesses describe an Indian matching his description." Eliza's fear was instantly consumed by a white-hot rage. She stepped forward, planting herself directly in front of Koda, her small frame a defiant bulwark. "He has been here," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "Every day, from sunup to sundown. He has been building my home. I vouch for him." Jed sneered. "She's bewitched, I tell you. Look at her, defending him." "I am defending a good man against a liar and a thief," Eliza shot back, her eyes locking onto Jed's. "You want my land, Jedediah. This has nothing to do with horses and everything to do with your own greed." A murmur went through the posse. The sheriff, flustered, focused on Koda. "Son, we don't want trouble. Just tell us where you were 3 nights ago." Koda's gaze was like granite. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked at Eliza. "I was here," he said, his voice low and steady, "watching over this land, protecting what is hers." The tense standoff was broken by the sound of another horse approaching at a gallop. It was Abigail Reed, her face grim, with Deputy Ben Younger riding close behind. She reined in sharply, her eyes sweeping over the scene with disdain. "Sheriff Thorne," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip. "Call off your hounds. I have just come from the Jenkins Ranch. They found all 4 of their horses this morning, grazing peacefully by Willow Gulch. It seems your star witness," she added, fixing Jed with a withering glare, "was mistaken." The air went out of the posse. The men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. Jed's face contorted with fury and humiliation. The sheriff, red-faced, muttered an order, and the men began to wheel their horses around, eager to retreat. As the dust settled, a profound quiet fell over the clearing. The physical threat had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But as Eliza turned, trembling with adrenaline and relief, she faced a new, more intimate adversary. Aunt Beatrice stood in the doorway of the lean-to, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by a hard, unwavering resolve. "I have seen enough," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is not a life, Eliza. It is a war. You will be killed or worse. I am leaving on the morning stage. The choice is yours. Come with me to Boston, to safety, to civilization, or stay here, in this God-forsaken dirt, and be destroyed by it." Sevens. Part 5. A House Built of Courage. Sevens. The morning broke, crisp and clear, the sky washed clean by the previous day's turmoil. The air at the claim was still, heavy with the unspoken ultimatum that hung between Eliza and her aunt. Beatrice stood beside the waiting stagecoach, a dark, rigid figure of civilization, her face etched with a genuine, painful concern. "Eliza, this is your final chance," she pleaded, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Leave this brutality. Come home. You are my only family left. I cannot bear to see you destroyed." Eliza looked at her aunt, at the life of soft hands and safe parlors she represented, and felt a pang of loss for a comfort she would never know. Then her gaze shifted to the half-finished cabin, its raw pine logs glowing in the morning sun, a testament to her own strength. She looked at Koda, who stood a respectful distance away, his presence a silent, unwavering anchor. He was not looking at her. He was giving her the dignity of making this choice entirely on her own. Eliza turned back to her aunt, and the voice that emerged from her was not that of a lost child, but of a woman who had found her place in the world. "I am not being destroyed, Aunt Beatrice," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I am being built. Out here, for the first time in my life, I am not measured by how small I am, but by how hard I can work and how fiercely I can stand my ground. My hands are calloused, my face is burned by the sun, and I have never felt more beautiful. The life you offer is kind, and I am grateful for your love, but it is a gilded cage. This," she said, gesturing to the rugged land, the unfinished home, the quiet man who stood by her side, "this is freedom. It is a hard and dangerous freedom, but it is mine. I am already home." The finality in her words was absolute. A tear traced a path through the dust on Beatrice's cheek. She nodded slowly, a gesture of heartbreaking acceptance. She gave Eliza one last, desperate hug, whispering, "May God forgive me for leaving you here," before climbing into the stagecoach without a backward glance. As the coach rumbled away, disappearing into the vast indifference of the landscape, Eliza felt not sorrow, but a profound, exhilarating sense of release. The last tie to her old life was severed. Her future, for better or worse, was here. In Dry Creek, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. The humiliating failure of the posse had left a sour taste in the town's mouth. In the saloon, Deputy Ben Younger, his face tight with disgust, slammed his empty glass on the bar. "It was a disgrace," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "We rode out there like a lynch mob, all on the word of a greedy liar." Several men, including the broad-shouldered Mr. Miller, the town's most respected carpenter, and the Cooper brothers, whose skill with forge and anvil was legendary, looked up from their drinks. They had been part of the posse, swept up in the fear and suspicion, and now shame sat heavily upon them. "That little woman stood her ground," Miller grumbled into his beer. "Stared down the whole lot of us. Got more sand than any 10 men in this town. And that Comanche," one of the Cooper brothers added, his voice grudging with respect. "He never flinched, just stood there, ready to defend his own." The seed of an idea, planted by Abigail Reed's courage and watered by their own shame, began to take root. They were builders, not destroyers. They were men of the frontier, who, for all their faults, valued grit and hard work above all else. What they had done the day before went against the very code they lived by. Miller pushed his chair back and stood up. "I, for one," he announced, his voice ringing with conviction, "am tired of being Jed Hargrove's fool. That woman is building a life for herself. It's high time we acted like neighbors instead of wolves." Eliza and Koda were working in a companionable silence, hoisting a roof beam into place, when they heard the sound. It was the familiar rumble of wagons and horses, but this time it was different. It was slower, more purposeful. Koda immediately moved to a defensive position, his body shielding Eliza, his eyes scanning the horizon. Eliza's heart pounded with a familiar dread. But as the procession came into view, their fear turned to stunned disbelief. It was not a posse. It was a parade. At the front was Mr. Miller, his wagon laden with finished planks and bundles of shingles. Behind him were the Cooper brothers, their wagon carrying window frames with real glass panes and a cast-iron stovepipe. More followed. Families she recognized from town, their wagons filled not with weapons, but with tools, crates of food, bolts of cloth, and furniture. Abigail Reed rode alongside them, her expression serene and proud. They rolled into the clearing and stopped, the men climbing down, the women lifting baskets from the wagon beds. Mr. Miller approached, his hat in his hands. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. We came to see if you could use a few extra hands. A house built by a community stands stronger." Eliza was speechless. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the incredible scene before her. She looked at Koda and saw on his face an expression of profound, guarded astonishment. He had expected hatred, violence, and suspicion from her people. He had not expected this. What followed was a symphony of creation. The clearing, once a place of tense confrontation, was transformed into a bustling hub of cooperative energy. The air filled with the sounds of hammers, saws, and cheerful conversation. Mr. Miller and his sons worked alongside Koda on the roof, a silent but powerful transfer of respect passing between the men as they recognized a shared mastery of their craft. The Cooper brothers, with their brawny arms and precise tools, expertly fitted the glass windows into the frames, letting sunlight stream into the cabin for the first time. The women, led by Abigail Reed, set up a makeshift kitchen, preparing a feast of stew, cornbread, and coffee that filled the air with a welcoming aroma. They brought Eliza a beautifully stitched quilt and a sturdy rocking chair. Even the children helped, carrying small scraps of wood and fetching nails. Eliza moved through it all as if in a dream, her heart overflowing. She carried shingles, mixed mud and straw to chink the logs, and offered water to the thirsty workers. She saw the prejudice and suspicion that had poisoned the town dissolving under the warm sun of shared purpose. People who had once stared at her with contempt now smiled and offered words of encouragement. They watched Koda not with fear, but with a growing awe at his skill and strength, a quiet acknowledgement of the man, not the label. By late afternoon, the transformation was complete. A sturdy, beautiful cabin stood where a desperate lean-to had once been. It had a solid roof, clear windows, and a door that hung straight and true. The scent of fresh-cut pine and baking bread mingled in the air. It was a home. As the townsfolk began to pack their tools, their faces glowing with pride and exhaustion, a lone figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Jed Hargrove. His face was a thunderous mask of rage and disbelief. He had been defeated, his power in the town broken, his prize snatched from his grasp. In his hand, he carried a heavy pickaxe. With a guttural roar of pure, animalistic fury, he charged past the astonished onlookers, heading directly for the one thing he could still destroy: Eliza's well. "If I can't have the water," he screamed, his voice cracking with madness, "no one will." He raised the pickaxe high above his head, ready to smash the wooden frame and collapse the hole, burying her hope forever. But before the blow could land, his arm was caught in a grip of iron. Koda had moved with impossible speed, intercepting him without a sound. Jed struggled, but he was like a child in Koda's grasp. "It's mine!" Jed shrieked, his eyes wild. "My father knew it was here." The spring. The only winter spring on this whole ridge. It belongs to the Hargroves. He had said it. In his final, desperate act of spite, he had confessed everything. At that moment, Sheriff Thorne, who had been riding out to formally apologize to Eliza at Abigail's insistence, arrived just in time to hear the frantic confession. The last shred of doubt vanished from his face, replaced by a weary disgust. He dismounted, drew his pistol, and walked toward the struggling men. "It's over, Jed," the sheriff said, his voice devoid of all its earlier bluster. "You're under arrest for attempted destruction of property and for being a damn fool." Defeated, Jed finally slumped, the fight draining out of him. As the sheriff led him away in disgrace, a quiet fell once more. Koda released the pickaxe, letting it fall to the dirt. He turned to Eliza, his eyes asking if she was all right. She could only nod, her heart too full for words. One of the Miller boys lowered a bucket into the newly finished well. The rope played out, and then they heard it, a beautiful, resonant splash. He began to haul it up, hand over hand. A moment later, he swung the bucket clear. It was brimming with cold, crystal-clear water. The first water. The promise of life. Part 6. Where the Sky Meets the Earth. Sevens. The dust from the departing wagons settled, and a profound, peaceful silence descended upon the land. The sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, its last rays catching the new glass of the cabin windows, making them shine like beacons of hope. The air was cool and smelled of fresh-cut pine, damp earth, and the distant promise of rain. Eliza stood on the porch of her new home, her home, a structure built not just of wood and nails, but of courage, sweat, and the improbable kindness of strangers. She ran a hand along the smooth, sturdy railing, the reality of it all still sinking in. It was real. It was hers. Koda came to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid comfort in the growing twilight. For a long time, they simply stood together, watching the stars begin to prick the velvet darkness, two solitary figures who had found their universe in each other. The confrontation, the fear, the struggle, it all seemed to melt away in the quiet dignity of this moment, leaving only a deep sense of peace. Koda then turned to her, and in the faint starlight, she could see an emotion in his eyes she had not seen before, a deep, vulnerable solemnity. He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt, a pouch she had never seen him open, and drew out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "Eliza," he said, his voice a low, reverent murmur. He gently took her hand and turned it palm up, placing the bundle in it. "This is for you." Her fingers, trembling slightly, untied the leather thong and unfolded the soft, aged doeskin. Lying inside was a silver bracelet, simple but beautiful, its metal bearing the soft patina of age. Set into its center was a single, smooth stone of turquoise, the color of a summer sky, webbed with delicate black lines that looked like cracks in dry earth. Etched into the silver on either side of the stone were small, graceful symbols. A sweeping line for the wind, a stepped pyramid for the clouds, and a single, tiny sparrow caught in mid-flight. It was not a piece of jewelry, it was a piece of a soul. "It belonged to my wife," Koda said softly, his voice thick with the ghosts of memory. "Her name was Meadowlark. She wore it until the fever came. It was her story. The wind was her spirit, the clouds were her dreams. And the sparrow was the strength she carried in a small body." He gently took the bracelet and slipped it onto Eliza's wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her. The silver felt cool against her skin, the stone warm, seeming to pulse with a life of its own. "I cannot take this, Koda," she whispered, her throat tight. "It is too precious. It is hers." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers, his gaze stripping away all her defenses. "It is not a thing to be taken," he said. "It finds who it is meant for. When my wife died, she told me that one day I would find another soul who flew against the wind, and that the bracelet would know its home. It has found you, Eliza Sparrow. You do not carry her memory. You carry on her spirit." He raised her hand, his thumb stroking the turquoise stone. "I have built you a house of wood. Now, I ask to help you build a life within its walls. I ask you to be my wife." The proposal, spoken with such simple, profound gravity under the silent watch of the stars, was more powerful than any flowery prose. It was a vow of shared histories, shared sorrows, and a shared future. Tears streamed freely down Eliza's cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of a heart so full it felt it might burst. "Yes," she breathed, the word a prayer. "Yes, I will." Their path, however, held one final, stubborn stone. Believing their union should be recognized by the laws of the town they had come to call home, they went to see the Reverend Miller at the small white church. The Reverend, a man whose faith was built more on rigid doctrine than on human compassion, listened to their request with a deepening frown. He peered at Koda over his spectacles as if he were a distasteful curiosity. "I cannot, in good conscience, perform such a ceremony," he declared, his voice thin and self-righteous. "It is unconventional. The union of a Christian woman and a heathen who has not been baptized would be a mockery of the Holy Sacrament. The parish would be scandalized. My duty is to God's law, not to the whims of individuals." His refusal was a cold slap, a reminder that while hammers and shared labor could build bridges, they could not always tear down the walls within a man's heart. They left the church not defeated, but with a quiet, steely resolve. Their love did not need the validation of a man who could not see beyond the color of their skin. They found Abigail Reed in her garden, tending to her late-season roses. When they told her what had happened, a familiar fire sparked in her eyes. She set down her trowel and wiped her hands on her apron. "The laws of God?" she said, her voice laced with a fine, cold anger. "I dare say the good Lord is far more interested in the laws of courage, decency, and love, none of which the Reverend Miller seems to have studied. If that man will not sanctify this union, then I will." Eliza stared at her. "You would do that?" Abigail smiled, a warm, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "My child," she said, taking both of Eliza's hands in her own. "I have helped found a town, build a community, and stare down more than one armed mob. I think I am more than qualified to officiate a wedding built on truth and bravery. We will hold the ceremony right here, in my home, and anyone in this town who believes in what is right is welcome to attend." And so, their wedding became not one event, but two, a perfect braiding of their separate worlds. The first ceremony was for them alone. As the sun rose on the day Abigail had chosen, Koda led Eliza up to the high pine ridge that overlooked their cabin, the place where he had felled the first tree for their home. The air was thin and pure. He had built a small circle of stones, and in the center, a small fire of sage and sweetgrass smoldered, its fragrant smoke carrying their prayers to the heavens. There, under the vast, open sky, he performed the rites of his people. He spoke vows in his own tongue, promises to honor her as he honored the earth, to protect her as he protected the sky, to walk beside her through all seasons. He painted 2 small lines of red clay on her cheeks, for life, and she did the same for him. They exchanged not rings, but simple necklaces they had braided from sinew and bone. It was a ceremony of profound, elemental power, a union witnessed only by the ancient mountains and the rising sun. They were bound together by the laws of the land itself. That afternoon, they walked arm in arm into Dry Creek. A crowd had gathered at Abigail Reed's home, not of gawkers, but of friends. The Millers were there, and the Coopers, and Deputy Ben Younger, his face beaming. Inside, the parlor was filled with wildflowers. Standing before a small lectern, Abigail Reed spoke, her voice filled with a strength and wisdom that commanded more authority than any robed priest. She spoke not of scripture, but of the human heart. She spoke of the courage it takes to build a home in a harsh land, and the even greater courage it takes to build a home in a world full of fear and prejudice. She held up their joined hands. "By the laws of this territory," she declared, her voice ringing with joyous finality, "and by the far greater laws of decency and love, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Dusk found them back on the porch of their cabin. The last of the sunlight pulsed across the windows, and from inside, the gentle crackle of a fire in the hearth promised warmth against the coming night. A gentle breeze rustled the pine needles, carrying the scent of their shared world. Eliza leaned her head against Koda's shoulder, the silver and turquoise bracelet cool against his warm skin. She was no longer Eliza Vance, the abandoned orphan, the girl who was too small. She was Eliza Sparrow, a woman who had fought for her land, earned her home, and found her love. "I was once too small for them," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "But now, I feel as though I have a home big enough to hold the sky." Koda shifted, turning to face her. Moonlight caught in his dark hair as he brushed a stray strand from her cheek. His finger traced the outline of the sparrow on her bracelet. "You did not grow larger," he said, his voice a soft rumble that was for her alone. "You showed them your worth, stone by stone, choice by choice. You were never small. You are my equal, my heart, my home." A deep, contented silence settled between them, full of all the things that no longer needed to be said. Their future was uncertain. Storms would come, winters would be hard, and whispers might rise again. But in this moment, held in the shelter they had built with their own hands, 2 people bound by earth and sky, they were infinite. And as the world spun patiently onward into the night, they rested in the simple, unshakable truth that they had chosen each other, without apology and without regret. The story of Eliza Vance and Koda is more than just a tale of love in a harsh and unforgiving land. It is a powerful testament to the unyielding strength of the human spirit. It reminds us that true stature is not measured in feet or inches, but in the boundless courage of a heart that refuses to be broken. We witnessed a woman, dismissed by the world as too small and insignificant, who claimed a piece of barren earth and, through sheer force of will, made it fertile with hope. We saw a man, cast out and stereotyped, who looked past the surface and recognized a kindred strength, using his powerful hands not to conquer, but to build, protect, and uplift. Together, they did more than construct a simple cabin. They forged a home from the raw materials of respect, trust, and unwavering devotion. Their love story became the foundation for a renewed community, teaching a town blinded by prejudice that the strongest bonds are not forged in uniformity, but in the beautiful, courageous act of bridging our differences. Their journey proves that a home is not just a shelter from the storm, but a sanctuary we build within each other, a place where even the smallest sparrow can find the strength to soar against the wind. If this story of a love that defied all odds stirred something deep within you, if it reminded you of the quiet power that lies in resilience and acceptance, then you have found your tribe here at Wild West Love Stories. We believe that the greatest tales are not about the battles won with guns, but with grit, grace, and an open heart. Don't let this journey end here. Hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with anyone who needs a reminder that courage comes in all sizes. And in the comments below, tell us, who is the unexpected Koda or the underestimated Eliza in your life? Let's fill this space with stories of strength. Join our community and saddle up for the next unforgettable ride into the heart of the Wild West.